The morning Nassau did not sleep began before dawn, when the smell of burning pitch drifted across the harbour like a warning no man wished to read aloud. It was the autumn of 1718, and the island of New Providence had become something the governors of Europe's great empires whispered about in candlelit offices with locked doors. A republic of thieves, a port without a flag, a wound in the side of the Atlantic trade that refused to close. The British Crown had recently dispatched Woodes Rogers to Nassau as its new governor, armed with pardons and a mandate to clean the nest. Some pirates had accepted his offer. Most had retreated west or south, back to the quays and channels where no warship dared to follow without local knowledge. But not all men retreat from a thing simply because the law arrives wearing a clean coat. Captain Enrique Salazar, known among every sailor, tavern keeper, and terrified Spanish merchant from Havana to Barbados simply as El Capitan Rojo, the Red Captain, had not retreated from anything in 14 years at sea. He had not retreated from the storm that took his first vessel off Cape Hatteras in 1704. He had not retreated from the Portuguese escort frigate he had taken by boarding in the middle of a squall so fierce that 3 of his own men drowned in the attempt. And he had not retreated from the informal council of pirate captains who had warned him, just 6 weeks before that terrible morning, that Nassau was no longer safe harbour for men who refused Rogers's pardon. Salazar had sat at that meeting in the back room of a tavern called the Salted Anchor, a low-ceilinged establishment where the floorboards were perpetually damp and the candles burned short because no one trusted a tall flame near so much spilled rum. And he had listened. He was not a man who failed to listen. That was one of the qualities that made him dangerous. He heard everything, stored it like cargo in a ship's hold, and drew from it when the time came to act. What he heard that night was this: 3 of the captains at the table, men named Corbin, Vast, and the one they called Eel for the way he slipped from difficult situations, had already made private arrangements with Rogers. Not formal pardons, something quieter. They had agreed to inform on those who refused to yield in exchange for letters of protection and the right to continue operating under a loose arrangement of semi-legitimate privateering. They had sold the others without quite selling themselves, which was the most elegant kind of betrayal available to men in their profession. Salazar did not let on that he knew. He drank his rum, spoke little, and watched the 3 men's eyes move. Eyes always confess before mouths do. He had learned that from his father, a Canary Islander who had worked the Spanish colonial customs and survived 20 years of official dishonesty through careful observation. When the meeting broke and the others filed into the warm Nassau night, Salazar walked to his ship, the Sangre Brava, a brigantine of 18 guns flying no flag at all, and he told his first mate, a Scotsman named Gregor Dunbar, precisely what he had seen and what he intended to do about it. Dunbar, who had the lean and weathered look of a man perpetually braced against wind, listened without expression. Then he said only, "How many days?" 3, Salazar said. 2, if the wind is good. If you are watching from any port in the world, leave your country or city in the comments and subscribe, because what follows is not a story that ends gently. The Sangre Brava left Nassau harbour the following midnight under minimal sail, running dark, her lanterns extinguished, and the cook ordered not to light the stove until they were past the outer channel markers. She carried a crew of 61 men, a mix of nationalities that included Englishmen, 3 Africans who had been free sailors for years, a pair of Dutchmen who shared a hammock and never explained why, several Spaniards like their captain, and a young Irishman named Cormac Doyle, who had joined the crew in Tortuga 8 months earlier and had since made himself indispensable as a rigger of supernatural ability and a fighter of reckless courage. Salazar stood at the stern and watched Nassau's lights diminish behind him. The town was not beautiful. It never had been, but it had a quality of compressed life that he had found nowhere else. The sense that every variety of human desperation had been packed into its few muddy streets and was fermenting there into something volatile. He had lived in those streets for 2 of the past 3 years, longer than he had stayed anywhere since childhood. He had buried a man he considered a friend in the sandy soil near the old fort. He felt no sentiment about leaving. Sentiment was a cargo that sank ships. What he felt was something colder and more precise. The particular clarity that comes when a man has made a decision he knows is irreversible and finds that the knowledge simplifies everything. Corbin's sloop, the Devil's Ledger, was known to anchor most nights in a protected cove on the southwestern shore of a small island the local fishermen called Cayo del Muerto, a name that the pirates used with the irony of men who believed in omens but refused to be governed by them. It was perhaps 12 miles from Nassau, a comfortable night's anchor for a captain who considered himself unthreatened. Corbin was a large, loud Englishman from Bristol who had been raiding Caribbean shipping lanes for 7 years, and who believed, with the absolute conviction of men who have survived too long, that his experience constituted a kind of armor. He had never been seriously challenged. He had begun to confuse good fortune with superiority. Vast, a Fleming who had come to piracy through a sequence of commercial failures in Curaçao, kept his vessel, a small and agile sloop called Merrill, closer to Nassau, but he would be at sea within a day. Vast was more careful than Corbin and less predictable, which made him more dangerous in one sense and more difficult to locate in another. The eel was the most complicated problem. No one knew his real name. His ship, La Fuga, was fast, faster than anything Salazar commanded, and the eel had the instincts of a man who had spent his life evading consequences. He would be the hardest to catch and the most necessary to catch, because if he learned that Salazar was moving against the others, he would go directly to Rogers, and the Sangre Brava would have a British naval vessel on her stern before sundown. Salazar had therefore decided to take the eel first. This was the elegant and terrible part of the plan. The eel did not know that Salazar knew, and the eel, despite his careful habits, had one consistent weakness. He had an arrangement with a fishing boat that operated out of a small settlement on the northern coast of Eleuthera, run by a mixed-race family who sold him fresh water and salted fish, and occasionally passed messages between him and contacts in Nassau without the knowledge of the authorities. Salazar knew this because one of the men on the fishing boat had, on 2 occasions, also sold information to Salazar, not out of loyalty, out of arithmetic. The Sangre Brava reached the northern Eleuthera coast before dawn, moving under easy sail in the kind of pale pre-light that makes shapes out of shadows and distances out of shapes. Dunbar had the watch. He came quietly aft to where Salazar was sitting on the stern rail, one leg dangling over the water, eating a piece of hard bread with the concentrated attention of a man who has learned not to waste the quiet moments. "Fishing boat," Dunbar said, "at anchor, 100 yards off the cove. No lights. La Fuga, further in. I can see her mast against the tree line." Salazar finished the bread. He brushed crumbs from his coat. The coat was old and dark red, almost brown with age and salt, which was the origin of his name, or one version of it. Other versions were less comfortable to repeat. He stood and looked toward the dark smear of the island. "Take the boat," he said. 8 men, no lanterns, no sound past the point. I want the eel on this deck before the sun touches the water." What followed in the cove of that Eleuthera settlement was not a battle. It was a correction. The La Fuga had a skeleton crew aboard. Most of the eel's men were sleeping in the fishing family's outbuildings or on the beach, and the eel himself was below in his cabin with a bottle and, reportedly, a letter he was composing to Governor Rogers. The letter was never finished. Dunbar and his 8 men came over the rail of La Fuga with the practiced silence of men who had done this in the dark before. And the few crewmen on watch were subdued before they could raise a meaningful alarm. The eel was brought aboard the Sangre Brava, wrapped in his own blanket, blinking against the lantern light, already calculating. He was a small man, shorter than expected, with quick eyes and hands that moved constantly even when he was trying to appear still. He had a scar across his chin that pulled his mouth slightly sideways, giving him a permanent expression of ironic doubt. Even in the moment of his capture, half-dressed and outmaneuvered, he looked like a man who had already begun identifying the exit. "Captain Salazar," he said, with the measured courtesy of a man who knows his only asset is time. "This is a misunderstanding." "Tell me what you offered Rogers," Salazar said. The eel looked at him for a long moment. The lantern swung gently. The Sangre Brava creaked. Somewhere in the rigging, a rope knocked against the mast in a slow, patient rhythm. "Names," the eel said finally. "Positions, anchorages, schedules. All of them, every captain in the Nassau circle. Those who wouldn't take the pardon, including me. You were the most valuable name on the list." It was not the confession that surprised Salazar. He had expected it, had structured the entire night around its inevitability. What surprised him, in a cold and distant way, was the absence of shame in the eel's voice. The man spoke as one merchant informing another of a completed transaction. There was a practical honesty in it that Salazar found, despite everything, almost respectable. He had the eel confined below with 2 men guarding the hatch. Then the Sangre Brava turned southwest toward Cayo del Muerto. Corbin's sloop was exactly where Salazar expected it to be, anchored in the sheltered cove as comfortably as a fat merchant in a Sunday pew. The morning had come by now, that particular Caribbean morning that arrives not gradually but all at once, dropping full light on the world like a cloth being pulled from a table. The sea was flat and brilliant, the color of polished copper under a sky that had not yet decided to be blue. The Devil's Ledger had 12 guns and a crew of 40. The Sangre Brava had 18 guns and 61 men who had been awake since midnight, and who were, collectively, in the particular mood that combines exhaustion, tension, and the proximity of unfinished business into something very much like fury. Corbin came on deck in time to see the brigantine rounding the point at the cove entrance under full sail, and he understood immediately what it meant. He was not a stupid man. He began giving orders with the frantic energy of someone who has recognized a problem too late to prevent it, but has not yet accepted the dimensions of his disadvantage. The exchange that followed lasted perhaps 20 minutes. The Devil's Ledger managed one broadside, poorly aimed, fired in haste, sending iron shot into the water and through the Sangre Brava's foretopsail without striking anything critical, before Salazar's gunners found their rhythm and began to speak in the deliberate, measured language of experienced artillery. 3 shots into the Devil's Ledger's hull at the waterline, 2 that dismounted guns on her starboard side, 1 that took down her main yard with a sound like a tree falling. Corbin's men began to jump into the water before the boarding party arrived. Corbin himself stood on his quarterdeck and did not jump. Salazar, watching from the Sangre Brava's rail as the 2 ships came together with a grinding of timber and the tangle of grappling hooks, tried to determine whether this represented courage or simply a failure of imagination. He never quite settled the question. The conversation between the 2 captains, conducted on the damaged and listing deck of the Devil's Ledger, while Dunbar's men secured the surviving crew, was brief and factual. Corbin confirmed what the eel had said. He offered Salazar a share of what Rogers had promised him as compensation. He spoke with the desperate practicality of a man who has placed his bet on the wrong outcome and is willing to renegotiate before the table is cleared. Salazar listened. He had the quality in these moments of absolute stillness, not the stillness of a man who is calm, but the stillness of a man in whom a great deal is happening invisibly. When Corbin had finished, Salazar looked at him for a moment and then turned to Dunbar. "Take what's useful from the hold," he said. "Provisions, powder, coin. Leave the men their boat." "And Corbin?" Salazar looked back at the Bristol captain. Corbin was watching him with the expression of a man awaiting a verdict that could go in any direction. "He comes with us," Salazar said, "until I've spoken with Vast." Finding Vast proved more difficult. The Fleming was not where he was expected to be, and the absence itself told Salazar something. Vast had been warned, or had sensed the shift in the wind through his own careful observation. The Merrill was not at the anchorage east of Nassau, where she had been spotted 2 days earlier. She was not at any of the small quays where Vast was known to take on water. For 6 hours, the Sangre Brava moved through the waters north and west of New Providence under steady sail, and Salazar sat at the stern with his charts and the knowledge that every hour he spent searching was an hour in which Rogers's people might learn that something had happened at Cayo del Muerto. It was Cormac Doyle, the young Irishman, who found her. He was aloft in the foretop at midday, shading his eyes against a glare that would have blinded a less determined observer, when he spotted the faint shape of a lateen sail moving close to the coast of a long, low island to the northwest, moving not east toward Nassau but west, away from it. Running without appearing to run, which was Vast's specialty. The chase lasted until mid-afternoon. The Merrill was fast, and her captain was skilled, but the wind died in the early afternoon, as it often does in those waters, dropping to a whisper that frustrated her fore and aft rig, and left her rocking gently, while the square-rigged Sangre Brava still had enough canvas to catch what little breeze remained. It was a reversal of the usual advantage, and Salazar used it without ceremony. The Merrill hove to when Salazar's gunners put a warning shot across her bow. A single shot, calmly placed, close enough that the spray of its landing wet the men standing on her foredeck. Vast came aboard the Sangre Brava, of his own will, without dramatics, dressed neatly as though he had expected a meeting and had prepared accordingly. He was a small, precise man who kept his beard trimmed and his coat brushed even at sea, and he had the eyes of someone who has spent considerable time deciding which information to share and which to conceal. He said before Salazar could speak, "You've already taken the other two." "Yes. Then you know everything." "Not everything. I want to know what Rogers intended to do with the information once he had it. Was it arrests? Naval pursuit? Something else?" Vast considered this with the careful expression of a man calculating the cost of full disclosure against the cost of partial truth. "Arrests, if possible," he said. "But Rogers is practical. He knows that some of you cannot be brought in without a naval engagement, and he doesn't have the ships for that yet. He wanted names and locations for the record, to show London that he was acting. The actual removal would come later with reinforcements." "How much later?" 4 months, perhaps 6. Salazar turned and looked at the sea. The afternoon light was thick and golden, the way it becomes in autumn in those latitudes, laying itself across the water in broad sheets that made everything look more permanent than it was. A frigate bird traced a long, patient arc overhead. He watched it for a moment. 4 months is enough," he said, to no one in particular. What Salazar did next was the thing that people in Nassau and on the surrounding islands discussed for years afterward, always with the slightly baffled tone of those recounting an event whose logic they understand in principle, but cannot quite reconcile with ordinary conduct. He did not ransom Vast or Corbin. He did not execute them. He did not turn them over to any authority. He put them, along with the eel, who had spent the day below in guarded and furious silence, on the Merrill with minimal provisions, a reliable compass, and a course plotted for a small French settlement on Hispaniola where they could find food and eventually passage somewhere. He took from them their charts, their purses, their weapons, and the letters they had written to Rogers. He took Corbin's logbook and Vast's personal journal, which contained, among other things, a detailed record of every ship they had informed on over the previous 18 months. Information that would be of considerable interest to the captains of those ships if it ever reached them. Then he let them go. Dunbar watched the Merrill diminish across the afternoon sea and said nothing for a long time. Finally, "Why?" "Because dead men make martyrs and enemies," Salazar said. "Live men who have been publicly humiliated make silence. They will not go to Rogers. Rogers already has nothing from them that is current, and they will not come after me, because they know I was willing to let them live, which means they know I am making choices, not simply reacting. Men who are making choices are more frightening than men who are simply violent." Dunbar considered this. "And if they do go to Rogers, then I will have been wrong, and the sea will have to settle it." But they did not go to Rogers, not immediately, and not in any form that mattered. The three men reached the French settlement on Hispaniola 10 days later, half-starved and substantially diminished in pride. Vast disappeared into the colony's commercial life and was not heard from again in any piratical context. Corbin eventually found passage to Barbados and worked for several years as a chandler's assistant, a transformation so complete that people who had known him before sometimes doubted the identification. The eel was never reliably seen again after Hispaniola, though stories drifted up from the southern Caribbean for years about a small, scar-chinned man who appeared in various ports under various names, and always paid for his rum with coins that bore unfamiliar mintings. The Sangre Brava moved south and east through the remaining weeks of 1718, avoiding the busy shipping lanes of the northern Caribbean and following instead the less traveled routes along the outer Bahamas and the upper Antilles. Salazar did not attack ships during this period, a restraint that confused his crew until he explained once, with the brevity he preferred for explanations. "The wind is wrong for it. We wait." What he was waiting for was the resolution of a larger crisis. Woodes Rogers consolidated his control of Nassau through the autumn of that year, and the last open resistance to his authority, a raucous affair involving a small number of pirates who refused to yield and were eventually hanged from a makeshift gallows overlooking the harbour, was concluded by November. The news reached Salazar on a small island east of the Turks, delivered by a trading sloop whose captain owed him a favour. He listened to the account of the hangings without visible emotion, and then asked specifically whether a man named Charles Vane had been among those taken. Vane had not been taken. He had escaped with a small crew and was operating somewhere in the outer islands. This information, for reasons he did not share with Dunbar or anyone else, seemed to settle something for Salazar. He spent the evening alone on the stern, smoking a clay pipe, a habit he indulged rarely and only in private, and watching the stars organize themselves above the Atlantic's far horizon. He thought about Nassau as it had been, the chaos of it, the compressed and peculiar freedom, the democracy of desperation. He did not sentimentalize it. He had seen enough of what that freedom produced, the casual violence, the broken agreements, the men who mistook license for dignity, to understand that Rogers's arrival had been, in some cold architectural sense, inevitable. The Republic of Thieves had always been a temporary structure built on ground that the world's empires had not yet bothered to claim. When they bothered, it fell. That was the nature of all things temporary. What survived was not the structure but the idea of it, and ideas were harder to hang. The Sangre Brava spent the winter moving through the southern Antilles, touching briefly at Martinique, at a small Dutch trading post on the Venezuelan coast, at a quay near Trinidad, where Salazar had buried provisions 2 years earlier and found them intact. The crew was paid their shares from the distributions of the Nassau confrontations, the coin and cargo taken from Corbyn's hold, and most were content, or close enough to content to remain manageable. Cormac Doyle, the Irishman, grew visibly with the season, accumulating the weathered authority of a man who has survived enough specific difficult moments to begin believing in his own competence without becoming reckless about it. In February of 1719, in a small harbour on the south coast of Puerto Rico that was not officially open to foreign vessels and therefore received them constantly, Salazar obtained through a chain of intermediaries a copy of a communication between Rogers and the Naval Command in London. It described, in the careful language of official correspondence, the continued threat posed by Captain Enrique Salazar, who had declined the pardon, who was believed responsible for the disruption of unnamed intelligence operations in the Nassau vicinity, and who was to be taken if possible and destroyed if not. The communication recommended 2 frigates. Salazar read the document twice, folded it precisely, and placed it in the logbook of the Sangre Brava, beneath the entry for the night he had taken the eel from his cove on Eleuthera. He did not increase his caution after reading it. He had been operating at the level of caution that he considered optimal for years. Additional caution beyond that level produced paralysis, and paralysis on the open sea was death by other means. What he did was simpler. He called Dunbar and Doyle and the 2 Dutchmen and 3 other senior members of the crew to the captain's cabin that evening, lit the lanterns against the Puerto Rican dark, and laid the charts on the table. He pointed to the route south of Cuba, the long blue space between the Greater Antilles and the Main, the threading passages through the windwards and leewards, where a ship that knew the currents and the seasonal winds could move faster than any pursuit. "We go south," he said, "the coast of Tierra Firme. There is work there, if we are careful about who we take and who we leave." "Spanish patrols," one of the Dutchmen said. "Yes, they are predictable. Rogers will send word ahead. Rogers's word travels by ship. We are a ship. We travel faster than his correspondence if we choose our route." This was not entirely true, and everyone in the cabin knew it. But it was true enough to constitute a plan, and a plan, even an imperfect one, had a quality of forward motion that Salazar had found over 14 years to be its own form of morale. They left Puerto Rico on a Tuesday morning with the northeast trade wind full and steady in their canvas, the Sangre Brava cutting south-southwest through water the color of deep sky, leaving a wake that closed behind them with perfect indifference. Doyle was aloft again, as he preferred to be, looking ahead at the long Atlantic distances. Dunbar was at the helm, quiet and certain, his hands on the wheel with the practiced ease of someone for whom this specific motion had become as natural as breathing. Salazar stood at the bow. He had a habit, when the wind was right and the ship was moving well, of standing there with one hand on the forestay and looking directly ahead at whatever was coming, not scanning for sail or hazard, but simply looking, in the attitude of a man presenting himself to the future without flinching. Some of the crew found this theatrical. Dunbar thought it was simply accurate, that Salazar was genuinely unafraid, not as a performance but as a physiological fact, the way some men cannot feel certain temperatures. What Salazar was actually doing, those mornings at the bow, was less heroic and more practical. He was running calculations, distance and time, provision and powder, which of his crew were reliable under specific circumstances, and which were reliable only generally. He was thinking about the coast of Tierra Firme and the Spanish merchant routes, and the disposition of the colonial authorities there, and the particular arithmetic of survival at sea in the year 1719, which was different from 1715 and would be different again in 1723. He was, in other words, doing what he had always done, looking clearly at what was in front of him and making the coldest possible estimate of the odds. The Sangre Brava reached the coast of what is now Venezuela in late February, and the year that followed was the most productive of Salazar's career. 8 ships taken without the loss of a single man, a cache of Spanish silver moved through Dutch intermediaries. A near miss with a colonial Guardacosta off Cartagena that became the subject of a half-dozen different versions of the same story as it spread through port taverns from Portobello to Curaçao. Rogers's frigate searched for the Sangre Brava across the northern Caribbean and did not find her because she was not in the northern Caribbean. She was in the south doing what she had always done, under a captain who had simply moved the table to a room where the candles burned longer. Salazar died in 1722, though the manner of it was disputed, and the body was never produced. One account had him killed in a boarding action off the Pearl Islands in the Gulf of Panama. Another placed his death in a tavern in Portobello, at the hands of a man whose brother had crewed one of the 8 ships taken in the Tierra Firme year. A third account, which circulated primarily among the Dutchmen and the African sailors who had served with him, held that he had not died at all, but had simply ceased to be findable, which in their estimation amounted to the same thing from the perspective of everyone who had been trying to find him. Dunbar took command of the Sangre Brava after Salazar's disappearance and ran her for 3 more years before she was taken off Hispaniola in 1725 by a British man-of-war whose captain, in his official report, described her as a vessel of 18 guns, carrying a crew of mixed nationalities, flying no flag, and found to be in possession of a captain's logbook of unusual detail and apparent age. The logbook was sent to London with the captured crew and seems to have entered the archive of the Admiralty, where documents of uncertain ownership tended to accumulate like sediment. Whether it was ever read there by anyone who recognized its significance is not recorded. What is recorded in a single line of a ledger entry made by an Admiralty clerk sometime in the 1730s is a notation beside an item catalogued as logbook, pirate vessel, provenance uncertain, Nassau vicinity, circa 1718-1722. The single word notable, written in a hand that belonged to no one anyone could subsequently identify. The logbook described, among other things, the night on the Eleuthera coast. It described the eel's face in the lantern light. It described the sound of the Devil's Ledger's main yard coming down. It described the afternoon when Vast and Corbin and the eel were put on the Merrill and sent away, and the quality of the light on the water as that sloop diminished toward the western horizon. In the margin beside that last entry, in different ink, possibly added later, possibly by another hand, someone had written 4 words in Spanish, in the small and careful script of a man accustomed to putting important things in writing without being certain who would eventually read them. El mar no olvida, the sea does not forget. The logbook, if it still exists, has not been publicly catalogued. Somewhere in the archives of empire, between the receipts of provisioning and the inventories of seized cargo, between the records of trials and the lists of the hanged, it may still be there, salt-stiffened, dark with age, smelling faintly of the Atlantic, its pages carrying the handwriting of a man who sailed under no flag and left no monument but this, the careful, honest account of what he had done and why, written by lantern light on a moving ship, with the sea's black weight beneath him and the stars turning overhead as they had always turned, indifferent and permanent and unchanged.